This is a discussion comparing the special education diagnoses of emotionally disturbed with social maladjustment. So, within the field of special ed, I've mentioned this before, but there are 13 areas of disability. And within those 13 areas, only a few have anything to do with social emotional issues, one of which is autism. That is its own standalone diagnosis. It is the only one that pretty much is the same for special ed as it is for the DSM. Another one is traumatic brain injury, and those are usually any kind of emotional or behavioral changes or social changes are due strictly to an external brain trauma of some sort. The other is other health impaired, and under other health impaired, any kind of social emotional issues may be due to an internal brain damage of some sort, like an aneurysm, or due to an ADHD diagnosis. But those three are not the big ones when we're really talking about social emotional diagnoses. DSM, we talk about anxiety and depression, and we talk about psychosis and schizophrenia, and we talk about conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder. In the schools, they just say emotionally disordered. I've also seen it listed as emotionally disturbed, or emotionally behaviorally disordered, or emotionally behaviorally disturbed, or it's the one that seems to have different names depending on what state you're in. So we're just going to call it ED. Okay, so special education differentiates an emotional disorder from a behavioral disorder. And it says basically you can get services if you have an emotional disorder, but you can't get services if you have a behavioral disorder. So we're going to go through what that looks like and how to differentiate the two. Because sometimes you can have a behavioral disorder that's actually caused by an emotional disorder. And you can, as long as you have the underlying emotional disorder, your behavior problems that are the manifestation because of that, then you're fine. It becomes problematic if you don't also have the emotional component, which is assuming a whole lot that they are divorced from one another. Anyway, we'll go through it. So an ED is one or more of, so A, B, C, D, E, any of those things, one or more of them. They have to have had it for a long period of time. See, the federal law does not define how long. Each state may define it as 6 months, a year, etc. And then finally, just because you have anxiety or just because you have depression or just because you have one of these, if you're not showing difficulty in your educational performance, if you have all A's and B's, they're not going to give you an IEP because of it, right? So here are the 5 characteristics. You can't learn, and it's not because of something else. You can't have satisfactory relationships with your teachers and your peers. You have inappropriate types of behavior or feelings when normal things are going on. You have a pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, or you have physical symptoms or fears associated with school. So let's go back through these. D and E are pretty straightforward. They look like internalizing problems, depression, and anxiety, right? But A, B, and C, I mean, those, it says one or more of these. It doesn't say that you have to have all 5 of these. So you can have one or more of these. Well, the first one is super vague. The second one is, you can have a hard time maintaining satisfactory relationships when you have conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder. Your inappropriate types of behavior, inappropriate could mean beating up another kid. So you see these things and you think, well, this could really be conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, anxiety, depression, pretty much anything that is a diagnosis in the DSM that's not one of the ones already listed in the special ed law. Except when you get to Part II. It specifically says it does include schizophrenia. It does not include maladjustment. So socially maladjusted children are not included in this category unless they also have an emotional disturbance as well. So it's saying you can have the inability to maintain good relationships and inappropriate types of behavior, but if they're not due to an emotional problem, you're just socially maladjusted, it doesn't apply to you. So what does this look like? Well, feelings of sadness, crying, restlessness, lack of interest, fears, phobias, worrying, etc. Behaviors that result from thoughts and feelings that are inconsistent, and difficulty maintaining normal thought processes. So really, A is anxiety. Sorry, 1 is anxiety, 2 is anxiety and depression. No, 1 is depression, 2 is anxiety, and 3 is some sort of psychotic related condition like schizophrenia, which, by the way, is extremely rare in children. The externalizing conditions, these things about inability to maintain relationships, behaviors that are chronically disruptive, but these disruptions have to be a manifestation of internalizing feelings or symptoms. You're not being disruptive because you enjoy being disruptive. You're being disruptive because you have anxiety or because you have psychosis, etc. And then here, this says the characteristic for this rule must be present for a minimum of 6 months duration and in 2 or more settings. So when they're talking about the externalizing behaviors, they do put a time frame on. It has to be 6 months. It has to be 2 or more settings. So it says educational environment. It has to happen in Mrs. Jones' class and Mrs. Smith's class. It has to happen at home and at school. It has to happen at Boy Scouts and at home, that kind of thing. So what are things that are not indicative of a child with emotional behavioral problems? If mom died and they're crying and having a hard time going to school every day, that is an adjustment disorder. Adjustment disorder, though it is in the DSM, is not capable, as you're not able to get an IEP for that. You cannot get an emotionally disturbed label for an adjustment disorder. And then if you put a multi-tiered system of support, if you put PBS in there, a positive behavioral support system, and the kid gets better, you're not going to get special ed. The kid gets better, so you can support them in the general ed program, and you don't need to put them in special ed. And then, so this is kind of a response to intervention model, but for emotional problems. And then social maladjustment, unless they also have. So these 3 are the rule outs. If it's not an adjustment disorder, it can't be an adjustment disorder only. If a response to intervention for a social emotional behavioral problems works, then it's not this. So you have to fail to respond to that kind of intervention. And it can't just be social mal. So how many kids have it? Well, a lot. Close to 500,000 kids. And it's increased considerably. Now, I would say it's probably even higher than this rate now from the 2001-2002 number, because I know that we're seeing higher levels of anxiety in kids now more than we ever have. And it is the 4th largest of the 13 special education exceptionalities. The first largest, learning disability. So where are they coming from? Well, we know that there's biological factors, there's environmental factors. We have lots of things like natural disasters. When this recording is happening, we're in the middle of the COVID crisis, and the kids, there's a lot of anxiety and then post-traumatic stress I think we're going to see related to this when we try and normalize what education looks like for kids. We also have, bunches of family differences and expectations on kids. So what do we do for them, right? Students, we know for a fact that students who have emotionally disturbed, they do worse than any other type of disability on many important outcomes, things like high school graduation rates, staying out of prison, getting employed, staying employed, being, having successful marital relationships. Oftentimes, these kids with ED do worse than any other group. So they may not on the surface look like they have a disability. You can't look at them and think, wow, this child, has some sort of blindness or deafness, or that they are have autism, or nothing about them might immediately kind of strike you as odd. But they do perform worse later on than any other group. So we need to be providing services and identifying them correctly because they are struggling if they don't get the additional resources. Okay. So what are some ways we fail them? Well, teachers like to put them in the most restrictive environment. I used to work at a school years ago. That school was so small it didn't have its own um, self-contained classroom for kids who had emotional problems. So the choices were if you had an emotional disorder, you could go in with the other children into a resource room 1 hour, 2 hours a day with the children with learning disabilities and other issues. Or you could ship them out of the school and send them to another school that had a self-contained classroom. Well, these kids often had significant behavioral problems and they were kind of difficult. Even if they didn't have behavior, they were crying in class and they were disruptive. So teachers didn't just want to get the child to have an ED diagnosis. No, they wanted to show that the child's um, emotional disorder was so intense that they needed to be placed in a special ed classroom all day long, and so they could ship that child out of that school. That's what they wanted. So a disproportionate number of their kids were not just placed in ED, they were placed in the most restrictive environment that you can. And we're not supposed to be doing that. The more restricted the environment, the less successful we know that the less successful you are when you transition to adulthood. More likely to drop out, more likely to have financial hardships, more likely to get arrested within the first 3 years. So what are some of the problems? The task of distinguishing between what is an emotional disturbance and what is social mal is a huge problem because nobody really agrees upon it. And in fact, the agreed upon nature of it has been mostly determined by politicians and not practitioners. So what is the social maladjustment definition? We've talked about what ED is. What is social mal? Well, we don't really know because why would you define something you don't have to diagnose? But we have some guidelines based on case law and some information in the literature. A lot of times people equate conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder in the DSM as being socially maladjusted, mostly because we don't really have anything else that has a strong list of this is what it is, except for, again, court decisions. So, socially maladjusted students are not those whose social but not emotional behaviors, they're not having meaningful relationships. They disregard and defy authority. They're not interested in having conduct that's appropriate. They're just not going to do what's expected, and they're chronically socially offending. And again, back to this is that, and it cannot be due to an underlying emotional concern. So when you go through these different things, when you're thinking about social maladjustment, they're pleasure seeking. They don't really hold a lot of remorse about what they're doing. They tend to know what they're supposed to do, but they just don't do it. They're more interested in these are my people that I trust, and these are the people I don't, and you're either in the group and you're trusted, or you're out of the group and you're suspect. And if you're suspect, I don't have to treat you well. They don't have a problem really with adaptive behavior. In fact, they can be quite manipulative and they do a good job of getting what they want, regardless of how it affects others. Oftentimes they're seen as hostile or non-compliant, or aggressive. And, when they're all done, they don't really feel that bad about what they did. So this idea, in a lot of ways, people divorce the two constructs as emotionally disordered ED is an internalizing problem, diagnosis like anxiety, depression, somatization, psychosis, etc. Whereas social maladjustment is more like conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, antisocial personality disorder. It's more of those. Now, one externalizing issue is hyperactivity, and inattention can also be considered, well, either way. But ADHD, remember, has its own diagnosis. It falls under other health impaired in special ed law. So we're not saying, oh, well, the child has conduct disorder and ADHD, so we can't get any services. No, the child just would not qualify under ED. The child would still get services under OHI. Again, this other thing here, which was really important at the bottom, The external behaviors may look the same. How they manifest their behaviors may be identical for these two groups. The question is, why are they acting that way? So, just socially maladjusted, quick way. We have the very depressed Charlie Brown, who has some severe anxiety issues, and then you have the socially maladjusted Bart Simpson. So just some of the things to consider, that under IDEA, there is a clear difference between them. That's not to say that it really is practitioner-based, scholars are not as quick to say that there's the two different groups, but politicians are. So we have to make a decision that there is a dichotomy, and we have to follow the law. Often these follow this internalizing and externalizing model, but doing that means that we fail to see that, maybe someone who is experiencing mania may also look like aggression, and the aggression may look like conduct problems. And so you have to always look beyond, instead of just saying, well, he's got aggression, and so he's not having this other thing. And you always have to think about why. And then, of course, oftentimes things are comorbid. And so conduct disorder and anxiety can be a comorbid condition. So if they have both, then the internalizing problem trumps and they get a diagnosis of ED. If they only have the conduct disorder, they get nothing. And we don't want them to get nothing if they desperately need the services. Okay. So this next set of slides talks about more legal issues about this. Why do we want to do it? Well, if you place a child in special ed, they get a lot of exceptions and accommodations. And if they have conduct disorder now, they are like, oh, well, I can get away with anything because I have all these exceptions because I'm special. And then if a child is placed in special education, there are other things that have to be done, such as a manifestation determination. If a child's not in special ed and the child brings a knife to school, the school may have a zero tolerance policy and he gets expelled or suspended. You can't do that if a child also has an emotional disorder diagnosis. You have to actually hold a hearing called a manifestation determination hearing to determine, did the child bring the knife to school because he has an anxiety disorder or some other internalizing disorder? Or did he bring it to school because he has conduct disorder or because he was planning on hurting someone? So maybe he brought the knife to school as protection because of anxiety issues instead of out of a goal to do something bad. Well, that right to a manifestation determination hearing is only granted to children who have special ed diagnosis. So when we're talking about treatment, the kinds of treatment options that we provide a child will be very different if it's conduct disorder versus anxiety. And then if you put kids without special needs into special ed classrooms, it takes away their resources. We have fewer funds and we have overcrowded special ed classrooms. Conduct disorder, even if you come in and you have a documented conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder diagnosis from a provider outside the schools, you bring it in, you say, I need my kid to get special ed. They're going to say no. Yes, your child has a diagnosis, but it's not one of the 13 areas of special ed. Now, there is a regular education model, something called subsection 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, or a 504 plan. A child with conduct disorder or oppositional ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, may be eligible for a 504 plan. This idea too is that, those kids that are socially maladjusted, they're choosing to do it, but being being a child with emotional disorder, that's involuntary. And then this one right here, I think, is, to me, one of the strongest arguments. If a child is emotionally disturbed and you put in a bully with them, you're much more likely to make that special education environment, a much more traumatizing environment for that child, for the child with an ED. And you basically set up an entire classroom full of victims, and you have to be really, really careful about that. So, this idea, the legal idea, is that the child with social maladjustment, it's not a true disability because they're deliberately doing it and they're not experiencing the stress. their behavior only causes other people problems. So there are several cases, lawsuits. Like I said, there are some case law. There is some case law that talks about this. In this particular one, the child with CD conduct disorder was ruled ineligible. He had borderline personality disorder, but borderline personality disorder is not usually given to children anyway. But also, that is not, a personality disorder is not part of what it means to have ED. So he didn't get anything. Substance abuse, truancy, boredom, those are not an ED diagnosis either. And then we have, for subsection 504, which we just talked about of the Rehabilitation Act, so when the district also erred when it neglected to consider 504. So like I said, children can get 504 services if they have a diagnosis of conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder, according to the Office of Civil Rights. But you have to have those diagnoses first, and schools won't make those diagnoses for you. So how do we test for that? Well, there's tests. We have the same test that you've already been talking about, the Achenbach, or the clinical assessment of behavior, which is a test that I really wanted to be good, and it wasn't as good as I wanted it to be. The basket says BASC-2, but you can extrapolate. But they weren't really designed to differentiate across between ED and SM. They were designed more to make diagnoses of anxiety or depression, conduct disorder, ADHD, those sorts of things. They weren't designed specifically for this non-clinical diagnosis. There you have to make this political differentiation. So what else is there? Well, there's the differential test of conduct and emotional problems and some other things. So they were also have some limitations. There's just some other issues, again, mostly that they were designed to be examining these things from a clinical perspective and not a special ed perspective and not a legal one. But what do we do? What do we use? I personally like this particular instrument, the Emotional Disturbance Decision Tree. It was based off of IDEA. It's criterion reference. So that's not normative. It's not, are you weird? It's, do you meet the criteria for someone who has an emotional disturbance? Okay. Doesn't take long, about 15-20 minutes to do and about 15 minutes to score. It's not really a rating scale per se. It's more of a contribution sort of system. So, here are the IDEA criteria. So these are the criteria because this is a criterion reference. And here are the scales for each of these things. And so each of these subscales map back to their different parts of the law that we just discussed. So on the right are the subscales, on the left are the parts of the law that it addresses. So you get these different cluster scores. And we're going to do this case study of Crystal together. We have Crystal. She's a 6-year-old Hispanic female in 1st grade. Of course, this is a fictional case. She's the youngest of 3 children in an intact family. So all 5 live together. Whenever Mama tries to drop her off, she does not respond well. And she got a little better in kindergarten, but when she started 1st grade, she started to have asthma problems and was hospitalized. And so she started to weep the night before and cling. She'll won't go into the building, and she's just inconsolable and isn't working with the children, isn't doing anything else. She's just sad. So here we did some assessment results, low average. So, probably 86, 87. Academic skills are the same. Remembering both of these are not going to be great for a 6-year-old. No speech language issues. We did get some general, scores that showed that she's clinically significant for anxiety, meaning that they are normatively unusually high. some issue, significant problems with withdrawal and depression and conduct problems. The Roberts, when given her, the Roberts 2, which is one of the projective instruments, you're seeing all these sort of trends towards anxiety again. And the RCMAS shows that she has problems with anxiety. So our clinical diagnostic questions are, do you think that she has an anxiety disorder? Maybe she's having some relationship issues. Maybe it looks like there's some severity with some educational impact. We really don't know if she's met the duration criteria, how long she's been doing it. And the severity seems unclear right now what her relationship with others are. So we have some data on her. So on your worksheet, I want for you to decide if you think her problems are not significant enough for even a consideration, if you think she's looking more ED, or if she's looking more SM, social mal. Okay. So we did the EDDT, and across the top are the exclusionary clause items. So, things like, has it been happening for at least 6 months? We have it documented as yes. Does she have normal hearing, normal vision, normal IQ? Yes, yes, yes. So we can rule those out as being the primary cause. On the right-hand side, it shows you the risk levels, and we're seeing that her relationship with others is highly clinically significant. Overall, highly clinically significant in all areas, very high for fears. So far, she's indicating really a lot of emotional problems. ADHD and hyperactivity, we want to rule that out because if ADHD and hyperactivity are the issue, remember it gets a different diagnosis. So she has some mild risk for it, but a lot of times kids will look that way if they have anxiety issues. Psychosis, that is another avenue by which you can be diagnosed as emotionally disordered or disturbed, and we're not seeing any of that. And social maladjustment, when she was given those items, we didn't see that either. How severe is what's going on? Well, we do have a severity cluster score, and it's high, and it's having a huge impact on her schooling. So we put this together. We have her T-scores in all of these areas. Remembering a T-score is a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 10. So her relationship one is 3 standard deviations above the mean. And so is her fears one. So when you start, now that you have all this other stuff and you can rule out, yes, it's been of sufficient duration. No, it's not due to something else like a learning disability or due to an intellectual disability. And yeah, it's having a pretty big impact on her. So whatever your previous decision was, can you make a decision now? So go ahead on your worksheet, write your decision. And then the next page is going to give you the recommendations that were made by the multidisciplinary team. And that is that they may want to consider it. Now, one of the things that needs to be considered here is adjustment disorder. Remembering that but she was having these problems before the asthma attacks and the hospitalization. And after about 6 months, things transfer. If you read back through the DSM, it says adjustment disorder, can turn into anxiety or can turn into depression. And it looks like for this child, it has morphed from just adjustment to anxiety. Okay. And here are some other specific ideas of things that can be done with her. Do take a moment if you need to and pause and read through them. Okay, so now we're going to have 2 other cases I want for you guys to look through. We have Edison. Here's Edison's background. Here's Edison's assessment results. Here's where you're going to, on your worksheet, decide what you think is going on with him. And you're going to get this data here, which I'm going to skip on through. And then you're going to do Conrad after that. Here's Conrad's information, assessment results. This is where you're going to make your decision, etc., etc. So I'm going to just pause all this. And that is going to be what you're going to do in order to finalize this out. So the very end of each case study tells you what the diagnosis should have been. Again, your notes are not being graded on whether or not you got it right or wrong. It's whether or not you processed the thoughts. All right, I hope that you found that this information was helpful in differentiating between emotional disturbed and social mal.